Well, today I sat down with the former Prime Minister, John Howard. On the eve of Anthony Albanese announcing the date for the Voice referendum, we spoke about the campaign. He also shared his views on Joe Biden and Donald Trump. And he spoke in no uncertain terms about the Albanese government's plans for misinformation laws. This is a longer than usual interview, but John Howard is always worth listening to. John Howard, thank you very much for your time today.
It's a pleasure.
Now, before we get into the Voice, I'd love to ask you about US politics. What's your view on whether Joe Biden has the cognitive capacity to go another term? And what do you think about the criminal cases that Donald Trump is facing?
I have a real problem, to the extent that that matters, to any American voter, with the choice. My problem is that normally I would incline towards the Republican candidate because their policies are closer to mine, but I don't think Trump should be president again because he didn't accept the umpire's decision. I mean, if I could use a cricket analogy, when you're given out and you invoke the decision review system and you're still given out, you want to leave the field. I didn't like losing the 2007 election.
Or Bennelong.
To Kevin Rudd or Bennelong. And I'm sure Paul Keating didn't like losing the 1996 election to me, but we both had to cop it. Because that's the system. You live by democracy and you have to accept the results. So, but on the other hand, of course, there are many signs that there are cognitive issues, and I don't wish the current president any ill will, and he's had a fair amount of family tragedy in his life, and that should be remembered, but I don't agree with a lot of his policies, and so it's quite hard for somebody who cares about America, and as I say, it's irrelevant in the great scheme of things to the American voter what a former Australian Prime Minister thinks, but that's the dilemma I've got. Sharri, I think what this highlights in the long term is that the political system we have in this country, the Westminster parliamentary system, is infinitely superior to the American presidential system. And people who are wandering around looking for an alternative to our present system, and although I'm not necessarily raising the Republican issue in this, although everybody knows I'm strongly opposed to a republic,
yes.
But the essence of a parliamentary system, a Westminster system, is its great flexibility. The Americans are locked into the strong likelihood that you could have a rerun of Biden and Trump. Now, the Republicans may not choose Trump, they may not, although some people have dropped out. Pompeo was going to be a candidate, he's deferred his ambition.
Yes. And
he told me that in London a few weeks ago. And he didn't say, I'm going to run in 4 years, but it was obvious that he'd deferred his ambition. So I think it's the lack of flexibility in the system that, that wouldn't happen in our system. The parliamentary party, for all its weaknesses, or the system of parliamentary government, for all its weaknesses, would deal with it.
On the other hand, the flip side of that is that we haven't had a long-serving Prime Minister since your 11 years.
Yes, but there were reasons for the other changes. And the goal must not necessarily be for people to serve as long as possible. The goal should be a good choice. And I fear that many Americans fear they could be presented at the next election with a choice they didn't like in 2020 and a choice they will like even less in 2024. That's the issue.
All right, let's speak about the Voice, Mr. Howard. We're on the eve of the referendum for the Voice to Parliament. Anthony Albanese will tomorrow announce the date. What's your message to Australians at the start of this campaign?
Well, the campaign's been going for a while, but my message is if you are intending to vote no, hold hard to that intention. Don't be blinded by an avalanche of publicity. There's a lot of talk that the ES case has millions of dollars. Well, I think Clive Palmer spent tens of millions of dollars with very little result. Australians are very hard-headed when it comes to politics. We have what I've always recognised as a deep deposit of Celtic scepticism when we look at the blandishments of political figures of whatever stripe. I think the case for voting yes is very weak. And what I find quite extraordinary is that the Prime Minister and his colleagues are sort of almost boasting about the fact that they haven't explained it. I'm against the Voice proposal for three reasons. The first is that I don't like anything that divides us according to race, and however you slice and dice it, it does do that. It does create a body that will be inevitably composed of Indigenous people, and the electorate for that body will be composed of Indigenous Australians. We
don't know how they'll be elected, though.
Big pardon?
We don't know how they'll be chosen, that body.
We don't know how they're going to be elected. Yes. And I've often thought of a speech I heard Bob Hawke make in 1988 when he said, the only thing that defined you as an Australian was your commitment to Australia. No matter where you came from, whether you were Anglo-Celtic, you were Italian, Greek, Christian, Jewish, atheist, whatever, didn't matter. You were defined by your commitment to Australia, and that's how it should be. Yet this proposal defies that, defies the declaration of the person I regard as the most successful Labor, and I stress the adjective, Prime Minister that Australia's had. Now that's the first reason I object to it. The second reason I object to it is that I fear that in the hands of an activist High Court, and bear in mind that only 3 years ago the High Court of Australia decided that an Indigenous person could never be categorised as an alien, even though that person was born in another country, owed allegiance to another country, and in every other respect was an alien. That worries me. It ought to worry other people who fear for an activist court. And I think the final reason is that whatever the government might say in the next 6 weeks, the truth is that any pronouncement of this body will have a coercive effect on the government of the day. And if this body proposes something that the government doesn't like, every man and his dog, to use an Australianism, will be yelling at the government to do what they're told, because this, after all, is the body which represents Indigenous people. And you've gone through all this trouble to insert it in the Constitution, and now you're going to ignore their advice. How can you possibly do that? And that is how politics can work in this country.
We've seen debate over whether the Uluru Statement from the Heart is 1 page or 18 to 26 pages. Anthony Albanese says the suggestion that it's more than 1 page is a conspiracy. We've seen ABC journalist Lee Sales give advice to the ABC that it would be misinformation for anyone to say it's more than 1 page. My colleague Peter Credlin was censored for her view that it runs to 26 pages. What do you think about all of this?
Well, I think that just illustrates the extraordinary muddle that the government's got itself into. I mean, there are countless instances of the Prime Minister saying that he's in favour of having a voice, a treaty, and truth-telling. Now that's the essence of the Uluru Statement from the Heart. And I don't think there'll be too much talk about 1 page versus 26 pages if the voice gets up. There'll be plenty of people who are saying the next thing is a treaty. Now, I think of all the absurdities coming out of this debate, there is nothing more absurd than the notion of making a treaty with the Indigenous. How can you make a treaty with yourself treaties are made between sovereign nations. We have treaties with other countries. We don't have treaties with bits of ourselves. And it only has to be stated to be realised as a complete absurdity.
We're seeing a lot of corporates and sporting codes come out and back the Voice to Parliament, some of them running strong campaigns. Qantas has painted yes on the side of some of its planes. What's your view of this?
Well, I think the Qantas example is probably the most egregious of all. My view is that large companies should be neutral because they have a lot of employees, they have a lot of shareholders, they have a lot of customers, and there's no way they can speak for them. And I did make some personal representations for the leaders of two of the sporting bodies that I'm close to. And
oh, did you? Yeah.
I just simply said, why don't you just stay neutral?
Yes.
And they said, oh, well, I think their governing bodies wanted to take a position, but how on earth can a large sporting... Take a body like the AFL, which is the largest football code by far in Australia, although not necessarily player-wise, but certainly spectator-wise. They've taken a position. Does that mean that every single club is going to advocate a yes vote? I know for a fact they won't, because I've spoken to people who are involved in the running of the individual clubs who quite resent the fact that they're there's an attempt being made to dragoon them into supporting it. I just think, as a lover of various sports, I just think it'd be a good idea if it's left to the individual. There's no way that a body like the AFL can know what their fans want. There's no way Cricket Australia can know what their fans want, or the NRL or Rugby Australia, and I just think it'd be better if they said nothing.
Do you think there's a risk that it would have the opposite effect and
I think a lot of
people would feel bullied into how to vote?
Australians do not like being bullied. They do not like receiving condescending advice. We have this, as I said, this scepticism, what are they up to? What do they want? That's the sort of reaction that you get, and I don't think that's going to help. But help the yes case. I hope it doesn't.
Do you still think it's on track to fail, the referendum?
Well, I can only take the advice of... I can only note what the polls are saying, and the polls are trending. But I've seen a lot of polls, and I think what's happened is it started off with a big lead.
Yes.
And as questions have arisen, that lead's whittled away. But I would, as somebody who wants it to be defeated, and defeated resoundingly in every state, I would encourage no voters to maintain the rage, if I can draw on a phrase that's well known in Australian politics.
We spoke a moment ago about Peter Credlin's Sky News video on Facebook being censored, labelled false and misinformation for her comments about the length of the Uluru Statement from the Heart, which at the very least are contested, at the very least. Are you concerned there's too much censorship of free speech, both in this debate, but also the Albanese government is pushing ahead with proposed misinformation legislation?
Well, I think the idea of any government proposing a misinformation bill is absurd. I just think we should say there are three things that maintain democracy in this country, in my view, and if you've got them in a robust state, you don't need anything else. The first thing is that we have a very robust parliamentary system. Got a lot of faults and it cops a lot of criticism, but it's very effective. And secondly, we have an incorruptible judiciary. Nobody says our judges are crook. I mean, we disagree with some of their decisions, and that's our right. But gee, they've got a reputation for integrity.
Yes.
And the final thing is we have a free press. I mean, we criticise it, and it can be very uncomfortable. I was made very uncomfortable by the free press on many occasions when I was Prime Minister, but that's their job. If you've got those three things, you don't need anything. You don't need a Bill of Rights. You don't need governments saying, well, we're going to define what's disinformation and misinformation.
Now, the Foreign Minister Penny Wong criticised you in private remarks last week at a Labor factional dinner.
In private remarks?
Private remarks that were leaked to the Sydney Morning Herald.
Oh.
Are you aware of this? She referred to your remarks in the early 1990s during the seminal land rights case, Mabo. She said that, when you held up a map of Australia on the 7:30 report, Wong said that your arguments were exaggerated then, and then she said that fears about Mabo, the apology, and the same-sex marriage haven't been realised, and she's saying the same would be the case for the voice to Parliament. Do you think you've been on the wrong side of history before?
No, I don't think I've been on the wrong side of history. I remember that it was in relation to some land claims that have been made, and I was referring to the fact that there were claims. I don't think there's anything particularly odd about that. And I voted no to same-sex marriage, and I don't apologise for that. Why should I? So it was a very imperfect plebiscite because the Labor Party wouldn't support an orthodox one, wouldn't have altered the result. And as far as the apology is concerned, well, I had a reason for not giving the apology. I don't think you can apologise for the misdeeds of other people. You can regret that they happened, and I did that. But if I think apologies should be given by people who are responsible for the things they're apologising for. And I was being asked to apologise for the misdeeds of others, and I wasn't willing to do that. And a lot of people agreed with me, a lot didn't. Does that put me on the wrong side of history? Well, I'll leave it to the historians, and the Australian people didn't think that because they re-elected my government several times after I had declined to give the apology.
Anthony Albanese said in an interview with Neil Mitchell that he hadn't read the full Uluru Statement from the Heart. At the same time, it was one of the commitments he made the night he won the election to implement the Uluru Statement from the Heart in full. Do you think there is a concern that he's not across the detail and that, specifically he hasn't read this?
Well, I think the cavalier approach he took in that interview, and he said, I haven't read that, why would I? Well, I think if you want to change the Constitution and you're the Prime Minister, you should read every damn bit of paper about it that you can possibly absorb in the time available. Mr Albanese is not respecting the Australian people by explaining exactly what is involved, and it's not good enough for him in answer to a question to say, why would I read 26 pages? You've got to learn. You've got to read a lot more than 26 pages to be a successful Prime Minister.
John Howard, an honour to speak with you. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.